Thank you. When Mary reached out to me last summer and asked if I'd be willing to do something on Quechee, the timing was really kind of ironic because I'd just been retained. I'm an architect with an office in White River Junction, and a lot of my work is in the field of historic preservation. And I'd just been retained by Simon Pierce to start looking at what to do with their buildings across from the mill, the old Tinkham block and whatever. And we're just at the early stages, but they want to do some nice restoration work, especially on the Tinkham block. So the timing was very good. 9 years ago, I did a pictorial history of Hartford in conjunction with the Hartford Historical Society, and that gave me access to a lot of just marvelous materials that you people have in your collections, as well as additional collections at Dartmouth, Vermont Historical Society, and material that I generated. So I had a lot of good stuff on Quechee, and I sweet-talked Mary into, I said, well, let's add Dewey's Mills to it, because that really is part of Quechee, in my opinion. And I said, you know, to get the crowd out, maybe we'll include something about the Woodstock Railway. Everybody loves trains, and Chris McKinley is here to correct me on any of the facts that I might have wrong about the Woodstock Railway. So that's why I said, let's do a bit of Quechee history, Dewey's Mills, and the Woodstock Railway. And again, the timing on the railway piece is interesting because for about 3 years, Jira Billings, who owns Gillingham's in Woodstock, has been after me to do a really good comprehensive history of the Woodstock Railroad, because I do a lot of railroad history work. And I was able to tell Jira about a week ago that I'm poised and locked and loaded to do that this winter, having finished up a massive manuscript on something automotive. And so he's quite excited about that. So that has additionally given me some good material to throw at you tonight. I will warn you, I'm going to move along at a good clip because I've got an awful lot of stuff. You know, old images are sort of, it sort of appeals to an alcoholic personality that, if one drink is good, 2 drinks is great, and 3, oh, what the hell, let's have a lot of fun. And so putting PowerPoint together, which can be very addictive, and I'm not a computer person, but, with a richness of historic images, I've got an awful lot here. Now, towards that end, I did run off a dozen copies of the PowerPoint and have them in a booklet over there. I told Mary that my cost is $10 a piece for the whole thing, and maybe the Historical Society would like to add something to that. So at the end of the program, if you've liked what you've seen, you can fight like crows in a McDonald's parking lot over 12 copies of the whole PowerPoint. But in all seriousness, I'm going to give Mary the whole thing not only on PowerPoint but on a PDF so that additional copies can be made, because I have packed a lot of information in here. So with that, a little bit of introduction. Why don't we attempt to get started here? Yep. There we go. So people a lot of times think that like Wilder or Quechee or White River is like a separate town. And I repeatedly tell people, although I'm not a native of Hartford, I'm a native of Hanover, and I live in Fairleigh, that these are villages within the town of Hartford. And some people get this instantly and some people don't. Quechee, there's maybe a point on a map, but there are no limits really to what Quechee is. The same with, so as I point out to people, we have the town of Hartford, and it's approximately a 6-mile square block. This is a very crude map that was on the back of the charter when the town was first chartered in 1761, the same day as Norwich, Hanover, Lebanon, and Enfield. And of the 5 towns, Hartford was probably the best one. It was considered the best watered, had some of the best land, and but this is a sketch, and you can see here the White River. Here's the Quechee, and again about a 6-mile square block. And within that 6-mile square block, we have 6 very distinctly different villages. To me, Hartford, and I think this came through in the book I did 10 years ago, I think is the most interesting of all of the towns in the Upper Valley because these villages are so distinctly different. Their geology, their history, their geography, their populations, and whatever. And each village has a little something to offer to everyone, it seems. So let's start with Quechee Village, which was actually one of the very earliest areas of Hartford to be settled. because there was water power on the Quechee River, where the falls presently are dammed. And also the Quechee River in that area was very narrow so that it could accommodate an early bridge. Because many areas, if you look at the Quechee River, is not very navigable as far as getting a bridge across and having it survive spring freshets and all of that. So by 1769, a simple open wood-span bridge, probably pretty crude, we don't have any images of it, had been built, the first bridge across the Quechee. And in the background you can see the falls. This view we think was taken about 1860 because you can see an early belfry on a mill that got swept away in 1869. This is an image that's been used a lot, and it's really a very, very nice historic image. And mill construction started, we think, around 1807. That is as far as textile mills. As I say earlier, by 1769, 1770, there were grist mills and sawmills in this location. But the first attempt at a textile mill development was 1807, and from 1807 to 1813, Elisha Marsh and others developed the first textile mills, which grew to be a decent-sized complex of both wood and brick construction. However, in October 1869, freshet took out the north wing, and the mill was undermined and collapsed into the river. Here we see the damage of that. Here's the mill pond, and you can see in the background a large section, center section of that mill collapsed. Here it is, what it looked like from the main street. It was just the brick belfry and tower, stair tower that remained. However, and you can see the covered bridge in the background between the two buildings here. However, very quickly, a new mill was built, completed 1870, 71. Very, very substantial, very nice brick building. Nice period mill building that's sort of similar to a lot of mill textile development that was taking place in New England, especially New Hampshire, on the Merrimack, as well as, of course, in eastern Massachusetts and down into Rhode Island. But a very, very nice piece of architecture. And this was, pretty substantial development for its day. Here again, I think, is a lovely image looking from about in front of the Parker House southerly on Main Street. Parker House, well, there you can see a little corner of the porch. And the covered bridge is, of course, around the corner from that wood frame building. There's Tincom's store across the street, which we'll get to in a minute. An additional stair tower, it looks like, has been added, and a very nice belfry, cupola. But a very good period building, and a very successful textile operation was taking place inside. By the 1920s, additional building had taken place. Here's the original building that we were looking at in the previous slide, and then some substantial wings on either side. This piece still survives to this day as the portion of the building that is occupied by Simon Pierce. But figure this building, this is probably taken about 1925. We got a nice mid-20s Model T Ford parked there, which I, as an auto enthusiast, I needed to point out to you. Another nice early view, early 20th century view, looking from about in front of the covered bridge, standing in front of the covered bridge, looking westerly up Main Street. Tincom's store is just out of view here, and you can see it's really grown into quite a complex of brick and wood-framed architecture. I think this is a great view. It's one of my favorites. Looking across the mill pond towards the mill complex, there's the covered bridge at the same location as the present bridge. And we figure this view was taken probably about 1910. And a lot of these images were taken by a photographer, George Fellows, who had a studio in White River. And I want to learn more about Mr. Fellows, but apparently on weekends, he would jump on the train and he would go to a village and sort of set up and take photographs. And he had a good eye for architecture and a good eye for just composition in general. And then he would offer to publish these photographs as postcards and local merchants. If you had a general store or a hotel or whatever it might be, you could then order his postcards and sell them, because of course this was during the postcard era. A lot, but not all, but a lot of his negatives are at Dartmouth College. Glass negatives are all neatly organized, and that's where I got some of these images from. And then there are others that I just had prints of in my collection or that came out of the Historical Society. But you can almost sort of tell if it's a Fellows image because of the really great composition, good eye for lighting, and good eye for architecture. But again, this is the mill complex before there were some enlargements done in the 1920s. Picture that I cleaned up and worked with as best I could. Again, one image is great, two is even better, and three, just have them all. But a fellow, and you can just barely make out his dog, standing on the ice of the mill pond. Here's the dam. There's a covered bridge in the background. And you can see pretty much the full extent of the mill complex as it came to be. Brick portions and then some wooden portions that come off from it. Another view looking right along the rim of the dam. And again, this area over in here is what is presently the Simon Pierce mill complex. These other portions, as we'll discuss a little bit later, were raised in the 1960s. The view looking out of the covered bridge shows the dam and the mill complex, the Harris Emery complex to the right, sort of looking up the river or looking upstream. And thankfully, someone had what must have been some, professional photographer take some views inside the complex. This again was all textile, all woolen mills, and the women were the ones who basically tended to the looms, making sure that threads didn't break, changing bobbins, etc. And then the men who worked in the mills were the ones that carried either the raw material into the looms or took the finished product away from the looms and got it ready for shipment. And here we see some of the men with their baskets that they brought in, some of the material, and then here we've got material being manufactured that'll then come off the looms and be made ready for shipment. The Parker residence, which is still standing, constructed about 1858. Joseph C. Parker, that R is there. It's interesting, no matter how many times you proof this stuff, there's always something, and when you see it is when it's on a big screen. But at any rate, Joseph C. Parker came to Quechee from Barrett, and along with several others, really developed the mill complex starting in the late 1850s. And this is a house that about a year or so later he built. Really a splendid piece of period architecture in the then very fashionable French or Second Empire style. He was right on the cutting edge of architectural fashion. This view was taken about 1900, I suspect. And Scott Tinkham's store across the street. This is one of the buildings that's owned by Simon Pierce. And it's interesting, the building looks a little bit dowdy now, but it still has all of its exterior woodwork, windows, glass, and so one of the things that's going to be fun this fall is to figure out a good period color scheme for it again. It needs a little bit of repair on the exterior, and Trumbull Nelson is on board to do that once we get the building well measured up and whatever, and then determine some other things. The building next door has been pretty well butchered over the years, and so Simon wants to put the fenestration on that building back to approaching something a little bit better looking than what it is now. and then we're determining what to do with the barn that's attached that this view doesn't show. But this is really a lovely period building in a very popular style, Italianate style, with its brackets and its heavy woodwork. But a really nice piece of architecture. And of course, this whole area is part of a historic district that's on the National Register. And if you download that, each building is listed, and what is known of the history of each building is very well accurately described. Another view from standing in front of the mill complex looking westerly on Main Street. Here's the Parker House. Here's Tincom's store. And Scott Tinkham, the store was built 1875, 1876. And then about 1880, Tinkham built a little narrow two-story house for himself, which you see there. Well, I think I've got another view of that, a little bit better. Yeah, there you go. And you know, this building, we've gone back and forth, and we've convinced Simon Pierce that it's worth saving. It's largely intact, although the exterior finish, someone came through in the 1930s selling, you know, asbestos siding, and so it's got it. But you know, taking that off, and it won't take a lot to get the building looking good again, and you know, getting a good period paint scheme on it. There's the barn in the background that is actually in pretty good shape, and is likewise going to be saved and made into better storage for the restaurant's wine and things like that. Again, nice little village view, circa 1800. Looking from, I think, probably the roof of Tincom's store, looking down on the Parker House, and then looking west on Main Street. I think this was taken about 1880. Kind of hard to tell. The church, which was built in 1873, I think, is visible in the background, the Congregational Church. And a few other things seem to tell us that this was probably done, taken about 1880 or shortly thereafter. And I think probably taken the same day by the same photographer, just sort of turning around and looking easterly. We see the community bandstand, the road to the bridge, and then through to Heartland would be opposite in this view in the foreground. Of course, most all of these buildings are now gone. It's really remarkable to see how open the countryside was, which actually remained so, you know, well into the 20th century.
Originally sheep pasture.
Yeah. And all of my regrets, having grown up in the Upper Valley and been here all my life, other than 2 years off at engineering school, is how the countryside has grown in.
Exactly.
You know, it's... Be that as it may, the first Congregational Church on Main Street, erected and dedicated in May of 1873. This is a George Fellows view. He always numbered his postcard views, and then had some kind of a white typeface. So it's always kind of, again, easy to distinguish what images he took. And again, a good eye for architecture and composition, and very, very nice building. It was done by a very well-known architect, Thomas W. Soloway of Boston. He was a very noted architect of his time, and he was the one who largely redesigned the Vermont State House after the fire, in 1859, I think, that pretty well damaged most of the building. So, you know, you have some buildings in the area that were designed by noted architects, and this building is still largely intact, and hopefully will continue to survive. The Methodists weren't quite able to outdo the Congregationalists, but nonetheless they tried over on River Street with this very cute little building perched, you know, somewhat narrowly between River Street and the river, but nonetheless it's clinging on, hanging in there and clinging to a very steep embankment. Not quite as fancy as what the Congregationalists had done across the stream, but nonetheless a very, very delightful period building in its day. And, you know, they spent some money. The Methodists, spent some money on a nice tower and belfry for the building, even though the rest of it's sort of kind of small and miniature almost. But again, a wonderful piece of period architecture. We don't know who the architect was. 1909, the Quechee Library finally built itself a permanent home after sort of being passed around town for some number of years in different locations. And this building is still intact. It's no longer used as a library. Scott Tinkham's house is beside it, and then the road that goes up to the school on the westerly side of it. Nice little colonial revival building. Nice little windows next to the colonnade. Interesting view of the mill complex and the covered bridge. This was taken in the spring of 1933. That summer, the covered bridge was taken down and replaced by the concrete highway bridge that I'm sure many of you remember. This bridge had gotten along in years, and of course, with the increasing weights of trucks and other vehicles, crossing from the railway station, which we'll get to in a minute, which was up on the hill where present-day Route 4 is, and the mill complex, that obviously helped to weaken the bridge considerably over the years. It's pretty much the same thing that happened to the wooden highway bridge between Norwich and Hanover, that just all the Dartmouth's coal trucks going across it day in and day out, weakened it to the point where there really was no saving it. I think that's a 29 or 28 or 29 Model A pickup truck for the auto enthusiasts in the crowd. Obviously, this was in the depths of the Great Depression, and it's sort of looking it a little bit. The tower that you see was is for the sprinkler systems in the mill building, so that in case of a fire, there was an adequate supply of water that could flow via gravity. In 1951, Harris Emery Company closed the mill complex and vacated it, and the property sat idle through the 50s into the early 60s. This and the subsequent photographs I'll show you was taken in 1962 during the winter. The buildings, again, had been idle for some period of time and were starting to look at. Clearly, Quechee had seen better days. You could see the 1933 highway bridge down there. Some additional views. This is looking across the dam at the mill complex. The windows are getting broken. Things are starting to look kind of sad indeed, almost kind of haunted. Looking from the intersection of the bridge and Main Street, looking up towards the Parker House, Tinkham's store. Again, a very idle-looking mill complex, looking a little bit haunted, as it were. Looking from up on the hill, this warehouse building is still surviving, although it's in very, very tough shape. This is the roof of Tinkham's, there's Scott Tinkham's house. That's the library, the 1909 library. And you can see the mill buildings in the background.
They moved some of that belfry building on the top.
Yeah.
It's truncated.
Yeah, they took somewhere in the 20th century, some of that belfry came down because what's shown on that is a little bit is shorter than what was at one time there. One of the Deweys, William Dewey and John Cone, were the two owners of the property. They bought the complex from Harris Emery when the mill was closed in 1951, and I don't know what they intended with that purchase, but they clearly never did much with it. And by the early 60s, there were stated concerns that the mill complex needed to be mostly demolished for structural reasons. I never knew whether to completely believe that or if that was just an excuse to get rid of it. You know, clearly the photographs that were taken in 1962, it doesn't look like anything was undermined or whatever. I suspect it was more just an excuse to justify taking it down because no one knew what else to do with the property, unfortunately. My guess is that had it survived for a couple more years, it wouldn't have not have been taken down, because that was the era, you know, when Penn Station and a lot of other landmarks were being torn down in the early 60s. And I think it's a true statement. Penn Station was taken down in 62 or 3, I think, that had that been a couple years later, it never would have happened. And I suspect even locally, the same would have been true here. The Parker House, again, a wonderful piece of period architecture. You know, by the 20th century, you look at photographs of it, it was starting to get kind of tired looking. And then in the mid-60s, there was a pretty serious fire that did considerable damage to the interior of the building. Luckily, the building was saved. But in the fall of 1968, it was acquired by Quechee Lakes Corporation for $20,000 and then restored at, you know, a $100,000 cost. That was a considerable undertaking. And I think even though there was a lot of comment about, and still is, about, you know, Quechee Corporation and whether it was the right thing to do or not, or this or that, I mean, that debate's been going for a couple of generations now. I think they really need to be commended for saving the building. Because that was just at the very, very beginning of there being any appreciation at all for so-called Victorian architecture. And it was quite an undertaking. They had to have knives made to match woodwork. It wasn't just going to the local you know, building supply place and dragging home some stuff and slobbering it on the building. But the building was saved, and thankfully, you know, it's still standing in good shape. And this is, again, I'm pretty sure that this was a George Fellows photograph, but I'm not positive of that. But it's looking from up on the hill, down on the village. There you can see the mill complex, the main mill complex. We're going to get to the Woodstock Railway in a bit after we go to Dewey's Mills. But this is present-day Route 4. Which were the tracks of the Woodstock Railway, and right about there was the Quechee Railway Station. This is the road that goes to Hartland. But you can see the countryside is still relatively open. There's the river winding its way from the west. So, Dewey's Mills. I always thought Dewey's Mills was quite an interesting little place. My family used to love to, I grew up in Hanover, my family used to love to come over to Woodstock. And it was always a very pretty ride. And I remember as a little kid, it was always a big thing when you went across the bridge to be able to look down and see if you could see the mill buildings down there, right at the head of the falls. But Albert Gallatin Dewey was born in Hartford, 1805. And Dewey is a very somewhat common early name in this part of the Upper Valley. Dewey settled in Hanover from Springfield, Mass, and had a big farm about where the medical school is in Hanover. And other Deweys settled in Hartford and Heartland. But I think the family was all out of the Springfield, Mass area and came up here very early on. And actually there's a wonderful recollection written by the Dewey who grew up on the Dewey farm where the Dartmouth Medical School is, just beyond where the old Mary Hitchcock Hospital. And he arrived as a very young child in the early 1770s. And when he was quite an elderly gentleman, someone sat him down and had him write his recollections of growing up. And of course that is as the whole Upper Valley was being developed and cleared. And there's one of his recollections, as he was saying, on a clear summer night, you could look up into the foothills on either side of the Upper Valley, and of course all of the land being cleared, and it was just constant brush piles burning. And some of them were just long, continuous brush piles, and how it almost looked like the aurora borealis, and how sometimes on a clear summer day, there was just so much smoke in the whole river valley because all these towns were being settled and being cleared. But it's really a wonderful recollection, and thank God somebody had the good sense to have him put it down. It's probably the best recollections of any very, very, very early settler. At any rate, at least we'd be distracted. So young A.G. Dewey, as he was commonly called, in 1836 started building the first of the mill complex at the falls at the head of Quechee Gorge. And his textile mill was different than what was taking place in Quechee, and that it was for reworking what was known as shoddy or used woolen material. And I'm not sure really of the process, and probably should stop talking about it and just concentrate more on this view. But I think this is as early a view as we have of the gorge, and looking up to the head of the gorge where Dewey built his first dam and his first mill building. And he struggled. It took him a while really hanging in there before he started to make some money and this thing started to take root. But nonetheless, after the American Civil War, they continued to expand the mill. The mill was doing extraordinarily well. And of course, one of the things that really built the mill was the coming of the Woodstock Railway, of which the Dewey family were original investors of. But here we see Dewey, A.G. Dewey, standing on the steps of his office a couple of years probably before he died, at age 81. And the main mill buildings, or some of them in the background, the falls or the dam across the Quechee would be directly behind these buildings.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
You have said that shoddy. I think he was making what was called felt, Civil War time. At Troy, New Hampshire, had a mill that made woolen felt that was used in the Civil War, and it was made from secondary product.
All right. What did they use the felt for? Do you know?
Uniforms.
Uniforms, yeah. The heavy Union uniforms were.
That's where you get shoddy work, because
You're right.
uniforms didn't last very long.
No.
It was like,
Okay, well that makes sense.
that's where you get the term shoddy.
Interesting.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, I thank you. You always learn stuff in this, and sometimes I don't know enough to shut up when I'm talking about something I don't know anything about, which is a lot of really, with textiles and whatever. This is a George Fellows image that I got out of Dartmouth, but again, a delightful shot, probably taken about 1910. The bulk of Fellows' work seems to be 1905 to about 1915, the late teens, along and through there. And I'm not sure, I don't think anyone's 100% sure what happened to him. But Dartmouth has, if anything is known about him, Dartmouth Rauner collection. But nonetheless, you can see the mill buildings and the dam across the Quechee, this being the mill pond. And up in, you can just barely see part of the Dewey Mansion, Birchwood, which was built in 1895. And was, I want to find a better picture, a really good close-up picture, because it was quite a period piece. But nonetheless, just a wonderful photograph. Just great composition, lighting. This is a postcard from my collection taken from down on the mill pond, probably in the 1920s. I think it was postmarked in the early 20s. But it shows a goodly amount of the mill complex. I got the misspelling of Dewey's.
That's not the only picture that's been spelled out.
Yeah.
The puzzle that we have what's now before the gorge is spelled Dewey's, just like that.
Really? And then sometimes you see an apostrophe and sometimes not as well. And I sort of debated on that, whether, there I've got it in, and whether that's appropriate or not. Because I don't think, there was a post office here, and I don't think that the post office called it Dewey's with the apostrophe. But again, I was not the best behaved student in junior high English class, so sometimes my grammar and punctuation's a little lacking. The Dewey complex in 1962. We know in 1924 they built a new dam and increased the head on the dam and flooded 75 additional acres, so to speak. I think the first electrification or installation of electrical generating equipment was in 1889, which was pretty recent. I mean, that was pretty early for that type of in a rural area for that kind of electrification to have taken place. But nonetheless, this is the complex in '62 as it existed. And a nice aerial view looking down. I date it as circa 1940 for several reasons. There's the Dewey Mansion, Birchwood, which was substantially, and I'll be polite, substantially altered in 1947 and 48. Maybe the correct word is obliterated, although the basic structure is still there. It did win an award from Better Homes and Gardens in 1950. And I knew the architects who did it. I grew up with their son, the Hunters from Hanover. But there you see Birchwood in its original version. And there are a few other things that caused me to think this is about 1940. There's the gorge. There's the highway bridge, former railway bridge, and the dam.
Yeah.
So there's again another view looking down. There's Birchwood and Dewey's Mills Road leading down to the mill complex. There's the mill pond in the background looking like a bunch of clouds, and the dam and the falls. Here's the gorge. So on October 1, 1957, it was publicly announced that a new flood control dam was going to be built on the Quechee River in Heartland, and this would require raising the entire mill complex, which began in 1962, taking it down piece by piece to the point where today there's absolutely nothing left of it. I don't know how long it took them to get the complex demolished, but it was gone certainly within a couple of years. Another view. Here's the office building being taken down. Looks like someone's trying to at least salvage what they can out of it and not just, whacking it into a pile of rubble. But it was certainly the end of an era.
Jay?
Yeah.
I'm curious, so when it was the mill closed before the announcement of the flood control dam? Because most of the mills in this neck of the woods were either closed or teetering on their last legs because everything was moving south for cheaper labor and cheaper power down there. So was the
Dewey's didn't actually close until just before they started demolishing it,
so
I believe.
Still operating.
And what they did is, what the Dewey family did which was Bill Dewey, was to buy the so-called Baltic mills out in Enfield, which had closed. And they moved their operation out there. And then I think it was in the spring of '71, when I was a senior in high school in Hanover, that finally closed. And that was the very last of the woolen mills in this whole area to close. For whatever reason, they were able to keep going longer than anyone else, because all the woolen mills in Lebanon by then had closed. And most of those, you're right, were closed in the later 50s. Because I was recently telling someone, I can remember, again, growing up in Hanover and born in '53, that in the late 50s, my mother every Wednesday morning would do her marketing in Lebanon because there was a First National store. Yeah. And that was the only grocery store around, and a smaller A&P. And we'd drive over, and in our 55 DeSoto, Hernando. And Hernando, yeah. Black and white DeSoto. My mother hated it because she thought it looked like a taxi.
Fernando.
But the car had been given to us by her father, so my father thought that was great, a free car. And the Mount Support Road, that's a whole other story, how rural all that was. But Lebanon was in 59 or 60, Lebanon was a pretty grim-looking place. It was basically a failed French-Canadian mill town. The mills were all closed up, and, sort of my first acquaintance with, the visibility of poverty and whatever. And then, of course, the fire and a bunch of other things. So, but that's a whole other story in itself someday.
When Dewey was out in Enfield, I think they were making green army blankets.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And they were dumping the green dye that they used into the river.
Yeah.
Which was controversial, as it should have been.
That's right. You're right.
Yeah.
Remember hearing some cackle about that. Yeah. Yeah. And not only the colors that would come out of the tannery, but the stench. There was a tannery in downtown Lebanon, which some of you might remember. Yeah.
You want to read Peyton Place, that refers to that tannery.
Oh, does it?
Yeah.
Interesting. So the flood control project also required taking down some worker housing and other structures down next to the mill pond. Again, this is the Dewey Mills Road, and the mill pond, is over in here, and so it was quite a bit of urban renewal, as it were. And part of that was also the need to either raise or move the Marshland Farm building, house erected by Colonel Joseph Marsh in 1792. Here's a picture of it before it was moved in 1960. And it was basically just to move it back, from the getting it further away from the mill pond, which was going to be flooded as used as part of the flood control. But a very, very nice, substantial house for the 1790s, and this certainly this neck of the woods. Hill was a mover from down in the Kentucket, Concord, Hillsborough area, and they were, needless to say, in the 1960s, doing a real stroke of business, not only because of the flood control project, but more especially for moving houses out of the way of two interstates that were coming right through this area. But here we see the Marshland Farm building, or the Marsh homestead, being moved back to its present location, and about to be set on a new foundation, getting it. But at least the building was saved. I think that's the important thing, and not just razed. So lastly, the Woodstock Railway. And I can remember as a kid, 1966, Edgar Mead wrote a little book on the Woodstock. And it's a good book as far as it goes. But as I say, I've been asked to do sort of a sequel to it and expand upon it. And since then, a lot more information has been found on the Woodstock. The archives are really pretty substantial in the Woodstock History Center. The Billings family has a lot of material, and there's just been more research on it and whatever. But I was a little kid going over to Woodstock. It was always the coolest thing in the world. My father would point out to me, where you could still see remnants of where the railroad ran. And actually, now that the leaves are off the trees, if you know where to look, you can still see, although it's getting harder, you can still see some of the embankment.
I've written lumber.
Yeah, that's right. Although it's getting, little by little, it's getting eroded, literally and figuratively. A couple of important dates. It was what came to be known as the Woodstock Railway was first organized in 1863, as you can see, as the Woodstock Railroad Company. And the ambition, the idea was to build a line from White River Junction through to Woodstock and hopefully Bridgewater beyond, and maybe at some point navigate up and over the Green Mountains to Rutland. Although I've never seen any plans as to exactly how that was going to be proposed, but I guess with a series of switchbacks. But Clearly, the intent was to get it as far as Bridgewater, although that never happened. It only made it as far as the eastern end of the village of Woodstock. But nonetheless, after some difficult tries and starts and stops, by September 29th, 1875, the line was officially opened, and the first scheduled train reached Woodstock from White River Junction, 13.88 miles long, plus about another half a mile of sidings along the way.
They first laid rail behind the current bakery in White River.
That they started, and then they worked their way westerly. Yeah.
Sorry.
What do you know about the spur that went up to the fairgrounds where Sykes Avenue
Yeah,
is?
the shortest railroad in Vermont.
Yeah.
We'll get to that.
Okay, all right.
So here's a map that was actually done after the fact, and I guess someone who had this map wasn't sure how to, didn't agree with it being Dewey's Mills and called it Dewar's Mills. I don't know if the person had a drinking problem or what, but nonetheless, I hope to someday get a cleaner copy of this. But all of present-day Route 4, from its intersection with Route 5 here in White River, all the way through to just about in front of Jake's Quechee Market.
Right.
All of that is the original railroad right-of-way.
Yes.
After that, the right-of-way diverges, and you can pick it out down between the road and the highway and the river if you know where to look when the leaves are off. But nonetheless, all the way coming up along Hurricane Hill, and then as we'll see in a minute, there was a cut through Shalley's Hill, and then winding its way. They looked at a variety of different ways to deal with getting across the Ottaquechee River. Was it to come down into Quechee somehow and then navigate the river? And it was finally determined that the best route, although very bold, was to go right across the gorge.
Yeah.
And it made sense because certainly the bridge technology was there at the time, although it was a pretty audacious move for a little rural railroad.
Billings had his fame from building stuff out west where he had to build that.
Yeah, that's right. And here's an original stock certificate, Frank Noble Billings, who his great-grandson Jira Billings is now Woodstock, and Jira and I become friends over the railroad. But this is his great-grandfather Frank's one of his stock certificates. And Frank was for many years on the board of the railroad. One of the biggest engineering feats was the cut at Shalley's Hill, so to speak. This is looking from, there was a highway bridge that crossed it, and center of town road and whatever, and this is sort of looking westerly down along the cut to the point where it opened up. And this was some of the steepest grade on the railroad. Another view of the cut at Shalley's Hill. Yeah, that is looking easterly.
Did you ever see the little item about the last trip and somebody greased the railway there?
Yeah.
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 And I have always been very curious about who did it, and I had always heard rumors that there were people that knew who did it, and it reminded me of that murder case.
I was going to say, Orville Gibson murder.
The man's book. Does anybody
Two of the great secrets of the Upper Valley.
Out of curiosity, it's like it was a conspiracy and everybody's to their graves with them. But if anybody knows, I would really like to know that. Sorry to interrupt you.
Got rid of up on the pig and threw himself out there.
So where the train came on to where Route 4 is, how did they come out of where the roundhouse is in White River to get on?
I'll show you a map in a minute. So when the decision was made to bridge the Gulf, Quechee Gulf, the first step was to build two big stone abutments into either side of the gorge. I'll tell you, the older I get, the less I like heights. And this whole piece sort of gives me a bit of the willies because, again, in 1875, There was an abundance of very skilled stonemasons because that was before the days of poured concrete. So getting good stonework done, was easy. But still, I'm thinking to myself, to carve out a suitable ledge in the side of Quechee Gorge, and then building up with large blocks of mortared granite, and then capping it so as to be able to receive the bridge timbers.
That was not freestanding stone then?
No, I'm pretty sure that was all mortared. And actually, I think the abutments are still there. So once the two abutments had been built, then the next trick was to erect temporary scaffolding so that they could put the bridge together, which we'll see some pictures of in a minute. You see some guys up there having their lunch. The total, the height of the bridge when it was complete was 163 feet, and the truss was probably close to 20 feet deep. So, this is a good 140, 133, 140 feet above the gorge. And this is all pre-OSHA.
Yeah.
All pre-OSHA. But nonetheless, the scaffolding was put up. The builder was R.E. Peabody of Groton. And I recently bought a book on Vermont architect George Guernsey, who was a very prolific architect from the 1860s, late 60s through until about 1905 or so when he died. Had an office in Montpelier. And some people claim that he was the architect for the bridge, and I'm not sure on that because there really would not have been the need for an architect per se. But nonetheless, so here we have looking from the rim of the gorge along the top of all that scaffolding, and the same guys having their lunch. They're really milking this thing. And the idea being that, with these planks was to get everything level and to have a walking surface so that piece by piece they could bring this wooden bridge out, which you'll see in a minute, and bolt it all together. And, no safety nets, no ropes, no slings, no cranes. It was just going to be walking back and forth, bringing heavy timbers and steel rods.
That ladder going all the way down.
Oh, I know it. Again, it just gives me the willies.
Now I can see where the term 2-inch heart attack comes. We're good to have off one of them planks 150 feet up.
So this is a photograph I'm sure many of you have seen, but it took them about 3 weeks to assemble the bridge, and it was a so-called A.I.A. truss. And in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, there was a lot of innovation that came out of, actually all out of New England and a little bit of upstate New York on different truss arrangements using wood to be able to build these massive wooden bridges, which is just a triumph of Yankee engineering. There is the long truss, the A.I.A. truss, town lattice truss. But the A.I.A. truss used all heavy timbered, sawn timbered diagonals, which you see here, and then horizontals, top chords and bottom chords. And then there were vertical rods, steel rods, with nuts and plates and bolts on either end that then held the whole thing together. And it was a very, very good design, primarily favored by railroads because it would take additional weight very heavily. So 3 weeks, they put all this thing together, and here's all the scaffolding. And apparently about 2,000 people assembled the day that bridge was going to be tested. And the locomotive that was used to build the railroad, the work locomotive, was the locomotive Winooski. And the Winooski was probably about the most famous locomotive in Vermont because it pulled the first train, passenger train in Vermont, on June 26, I think, 1848, from White River Junction to Bethel, when the first section of the Vermont Central Railroad opened. And I guess that was quite a day of revelry and celebration in White River Junction. But nonetheless, so the Winooski was getting along in years by the time the Woodstock was built, and was basically loaned to the Woodstock by the Vermont Central as a work locomotive. But here it is, creeping out onto the trestle, and everyone watched in the hushed fascination, and that bridge only settled about 1/4 of an inch under the weight, and that's about a 25,000 ton or 25-ton locomotive. and the guys are up on top of the tender. It was a wood-burning locomotive. But that was quite a day when that bridge was tested, and it held together as the engineers expected it would. So before the scaffolding was taken down, the sides were covered with vertical boarding so as to protect all of the truss work from the elements of weather and deterioration. And of course, across the top, they would put boards and then cover the boards with tin so that if there were any sparks from the locomotive, it wouldn't set the bridge on fire. And here we have, after the scaffolding is gone, this is looking easterly, and you can't see it in this view, but there's a ladder and all that came down to a little platform underneath here, and there was a door that you could open, and a couple of times a week someone had the job of going in there and walking along a catwalk and looking down 140 odd feet to the running water to just inspect the trusses to make sure that none of the timbers had snapped or anything had come loose. And somewhere there's a really good account by a man who, as a young boy, used to accompany his father. And in later life, he wrote about going in there, and he only did it once. But that was the highest railroad bridge in the state of Vermont, 163 feet above the water of the Quechee River. And you know, it was a statistic that was known far and near. By 1906, because the railroad was running heavier locomotives as well as heavy coal cars for both Dewey's Mills and the Woodstock Inn, and whatever, two big, massive laminated wooden arches were added inside to help stiffen the bridge in an effort to postpone the day when the bridge was going to have to be replaced. But a remarkable, wonderful piece of engineering. Now, it was not uncommon when building railroads to want to get them into service as soon as possible so as to start providing revenue for the railroad company. So a lot of cases, what they would do was build a temporary trestle over areas where that would later get filled. And then during idle hours, they would little by little bring out dirt and fill and build up around and bury the trestle. So what we see here is this is right on the curve of Route 4, right where it passes over the interstate, or just a little bit to the west of that. Just before, if you're heading west on Route 4 and you've just crossed over the interstate, before you get to the mobile station and the southbound exit, that's all fill, and it's been widened out. But that's where this view is. And I'm trying to think of the road that goes down and.
Well, the River Road.
That road does go down to the river.
Yeah, and that's where this was taken from. So here we have the Winooski. The railroad is in operation, and they've got flat cars they're bringing out, and they're shoveling off fill. And then little by little, they're going to build up around this trestle and substantially bury it. And actually, I found I don't know if I included them or not. No, I found the original drawings for the engineer's drawings for putting that trestle together. But here's a picture of Winooski, and again, it's getting kind of long in age. It was soon, I think it was scrapped in the late 1870s by the Vermont Central. But this again pulled the first train from White River Junction to Bethel and back, and then was in regular service from White River Junction through to Rouse's Point, and then later became again the work locomotive that built the.
Back up to that trestle for a second. So I'm thinking the interstate must have gone right smack down through there. So when they dug the interstate, is that where the bridge is in there somewhere?
I think the interstate would just be behind where this photograph was taken.
Oh, okay, all right.
As I say, this is, it's sort of a gradual curve that you make, and the first part of that curve is passing over the two lanes of the interstate, and then there's a road that goes down.
Right, so that's before the interstate then.
This would be just past the interstate, but before you get to that mobile gas station.
Quechee side.
Yeah. And again, that whole area, so that Quechee gas station would be just beyond this trestled area on native soil. But if you look, that whole section of the road, you can see it was built up. And what they did when they turned it from railroad into highway, they just widened that embankment.
That would make it, being built, that'd make it easier to put the interstate in.
Oh, yeah.
They wouldn't have to blast any.
Yeah. So the first locomotive on the Woodstock Railway, within a couple of weeks of it opening, the first couple of weeks it was the Winooski going back and forth, but then the Woodstock bought its first locomotive and they named it, against the protest of Albert Dewey, they named it the A.G. Dewey. Locomotive number 1, and it was built by the Manchester Locomotive Works in Manchester, New Hampshire, which was a large locomotive building shop in its day. And here we see it's a wood-burning locomotive with a kind of pile of wood in the tender, an American type, 4 pilot wheels, 4 driving wheels. You can tell it's a wood burner by that smokestack with the big flare funnel arrangement, and that was to keep sparks from going out. There's wire across the top of that and a series of baffles and whatever inside, because again, burning wood, you created and with a real good draft to the fire, you created a lot of potential sparks that could light everything on fire. A headlamp that burned spermide whale oil, well, probably by this point kerosene, but a good period locomotive, but it was bigger than what the railroad needed. So after 5 or 6 years of service, successful service, nonetheless, they traded it to the Connecticut and Passumpsic Rivers Railroad, which ran from White River Junction through Newport, Vermont, for a smaller locomotive that the Passumpsic Rivers Road had called the Newport, and this became the second A.G. Dewey. And this locomotive they hung on to until 1918, and it served the railroad long and well. Again, a very, very typical wood-burning locomotive of the period, but a little bit better suited, a little bit lighter, and a little bit better suited for duty on the Woodstock Railway. And this was their only locomotive until the 1890s. Here we see a very nice portrait of the second A.G. Dewey getting ready to head out of Woodstock in sometime in the early 1880s. I suspect this was taken shortly after they acquired it, with a baggage car and a coach on behind. Plenty of wood for the run to White River. And there's a view of the interior of the coach Woodstock. And this would have been how you would have traveled back and forth from Woodstock, Quechee, Dewey's Mills, or Hartford to White River. Velvet seats with these nice brass package trays and some nice leaded glass and pretty gas lighting. Pretty classy operation in its day. I suspect they were.
They wouldn't have turned the train around. They would.
So in 1889, the A.G. Dewey was it was time for some service work, and so it was reboilered to burn coal. Coal was becoming much more common as a source of fuel for locomotives. It produced a hotter fire and better steam. So, but it required rebuilding the firebox of the and the boilers to a certain extent. So here's the A.G. Dewey after it had been rebuilt. You can tell it's now burning coal because it's just a straight smokestack on it. Coal did not produce the cinders or sparks that wood did. It produced cinders, but not hot sparks that could potentially set things on fire.
How did they turn the locomotive around in Woodstock?
They had a turntable.
Did they?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and the pit's still there.
All right.
So the Dewey family, which were major stockholders in the Woodstock Railway, and were doing well by this point, in part because of the success of shipping product and receiving product on the Woodstock Railway. So they had this delightful little steam-powered inspection car built so that the family could either get into Woodstock or into White River Junction. And here we see it in its first version before it was sort of rebuilt and modified. about a seat in the front, and the engineer, and he'd have a little bit of fuel on, and you got to admit, something like that would have been really cool.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you know, even non-railroad people have to admit, something like that would have been on a nice summer day a bunch of fun. And here it is after some further refinement and rebuilding. We see the Dewey family sitting in the front and the operator in the back. And this is known as the Gertie Buck. And the Gertie Buck is wonderfully intact and is on display at the Shelburne Museum.
Oh, I gotta go see that.
I've seen it.
It's down in the train shed, down by the station.
Yeah.
And it's beautifully preserved. I don't think it's been run in a long, long time, but it's beautifully preserved. And again, can you imagine a nice summer day, you know, leisurely Saturday afternoon, and you know, to go into White River to see the movies, the early flickers, or to go to Woodstock and have dinner or something like that? I mean, nothing could be cooler than riding on something like that. And if you, what?
Did they have their own switch?
Yep, they kept it in a section house up at the mill, which I'll show you in a minute, or up at the station, Dewey Station.
Do you know who gave that to the museum?
No, I don't.
Just curious.
Be interesting to find out,
Yeah.
because I do want to contact the museum and just get whatever information they've got about it, because it's obviously got to be featured in my book on the Woodstock. For years, I was frustrated. I couldn't find any images at all of the Quechee station. I knew approximately where it sat, but not quite entirely. And then I found this view, which is horribly damaged in the 10 years ago in the archives of the Hartford Historical Society. So I scanned it and said maybe I can do something with it. And so this is cleaned up about as best I can make it. But it shows the station and someone's looks like a border collie, which would be appropriate for farm country. And this is looking west. And the station, this would be present-day Route 4. And immediately to our back would be the road that came up from Quechee Village across the covered bridge and up the hill and to Heartland. So it gives you, I'm trying to think what's sitting there now. But it gives you sort of
there's no remnant at all, no suggestion that there was ever a railway station there now. But it gives you
where the
So the
new
ski
store
hill would
was.
be right there back behind.
yeah, and I've got a map I'll show you in a minute.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. The Woodstock Railway did a lot running all kinds of special events. And of course, you know, this is before the advent of the automobile, so this was basically your ticket out of town, literally and figuratively, to go see, you know, a play, or Teddy Roosevelt were giving a speech somewhere, or who knows what. So the Woodstock was always running special trains, and here we see folks at the station. This is the easterly side of the station, getting ready to board the Woodstock Railway for a run into White River, and then from White River you could connect and go virtually anywhere. And here are a couple of different little broadsides. Again, the Woodstock Railway advertising a bicycle meet in 1896, and of course this was at the height of the bicycle craze, and there used to be a lot of bicycle groups that came through Woodstock. And of course the roads were, you know, were pretty good for bicycling, and it was beautiful countryside. So I'm not sure if this was to go in and see the bicyclists or to bring your bicycle along.
Well, that was for Dewey's Mills.
Yeah.
How long did the trip take?
15 to Tassville.
We'll get to that in a minute.
Oh,
And a couple of other things, going up to Lake Champlain and Vergennes and return, 1900. But again, a special train from Woodstock, Tassville, Quechee, Dewey's Mills, Windsor, blah, blah. Arrange to take the day off and enjoy yourselves. And I suspect if you work 6 days a week in mills in Quechee or in Dewey's Mills, it was probably nice to have a day off and actually go somewhere and forget your woes for the day and see something. Another view of the combination baggage and coach car Woodstock at the Quechee station, circa 1900. These guys look pretty pleased with themselves. They must be heading out of town, or maybe they're coming back from a good foray somewhere. Probably coming back. Their wives will be glad to see them, I'm sure, half intoxicated.
Guy standing there.
A view we often see, Edgar Mead had this in his book, and we'll talk about the J.G. Porter locomotive that you see here in a minute. But this is eastbound in the wintry day, 1920, and folks are getting ready to board the train, which is stopped, and you can see some activity here on the platform, probably getting mail off the train and putting some baggage on. So, railway service at Quechee circa 1905. This gives you an idea of regular scheduled runs in the morning. Train number 6 arrived at White River Junction, so that was eastbound. And then later in the day, and then 2 trains in the afternoon. And so you can see it's about an hour and a half, hour and 45, 37 to 45 minutes.
All right, okay. So
it depends on, how long the stops were and whether it was an easterly bound or westerly bound train. But it was not just a sleepy little railroad by any means, and its revenues were good. It was unlike some short lines that struggled. Right from the start, the Woodstock did a good job. In 1908, there was a very good article published in a Model Railroaders magazine on modeling the Woodstock Railway. And the author must have gotten a hold of the old railway maps from the state of Vermont, I would guess, and did a great job sort of putting together at each of the stops what the layout was. And I think this is, to my knowledge, this is extraordinarily accurate. So this would be present-day Route 4, and here's the river road or street that comes up from Quechee. Here's going down into the village of Quechee and going to Heartland. So again, here's where the present Four Corners and flashing light is, and here's where the railway station is with its platform. Driveway that came in and swept around. And then a lot of cattle were shipped out of here. So there were holding pens for cattle in a cattle shed and holding pens. And then there was a section house for a hand car so that the section crews could inspect the lines and make any repairs necessary. So that's to Dewey's Mills or to White River Junction, and that's to Taftesville. And again, this Kerrigan's Jake's Quechee Market, which I designed, is right about in there. And then Route 4 veers off, and the rest of the way to Woodstock is not.
Cattle shed shipping in White River, where the current freight house thing is. I remember when there was some cattle loading things there. The Boston and Maine used to take cattle from White River to Brighton, Mass.
Yeah,
the slaughterhouses. Yeah,
that's right. Because the biggest slaughterhouses in all New England were in Brighton.
Right.
Here's Dewey's Mills. Here's the Ottaquechee and the Gorge. Here's the railway bridge, now Route 4 Highway Bridge. And both of these buildings have survived. They've been moved. I think this one's in its original location, remains in its original location, and then this one was either moved to one side or the other of it. That's a coal shed where they received hopper loads of coal for the boilers at the mill, and then again another little section house, and maybe that's where the Gertie buck was kept as well. But again, all of this is Route 5. The visitor center is right about in here.
What are the 2 other roads you picture there?
Route 4.
Now, did that actually go down to the mills, or did they have to haul their stuff from
the railroad didn't go down to the mills, so this is the road that goes down to the mills. Whether there was another road or I'm not sure that there was, because nothing shows up on the USGS maps. But maybe that was just some kind of a trail or something. But Dewey's Mills Road would be where this road is shown, and then just comes out onto Route 5 or Route 4, excuse me. Even for Hartford Village, there was a small station. This is looking easterly and would be right where the VA cutoff road is now. But a cute little building, basically just a flag stop. If someone was out and the flag was down, they'd stop. Otherwise, probably didn't do too much business. And again, a little section house beside it.
Is that a kid in the picture in a track?
Yeah.
The VA cutoff.
Yeah.
Is right where the station was.
Yeah. So the view we were just looking at was probably taken right standing over the bridge, over the VA cutoff road. That would be up to the VA, and that would be down to the woolen mills and Hartford and the bridge at Hartford Village. That's west to Dewey's Mills, and that's continuing into White River Junction. So that kid we saw on the tracks was standing about in there. Now, of course, this is Route 4, and the VA cutoff road comes up onto Route 4.
Stations in that area below it, or 3 other stations.
And then there was about a mile or two further east, but not quite into White River Junction, right where present-day Route 4 and Route 5 come together. And this would be just almost exactly where it was a gas place until recently. But right within that, the interior of that section, the interstate would be just behind us. There was a two-stall engine house built in 1890 for that the Woodstock built and owned, and a turntable out front.
Okay.
And although you can't see it, but that sort of grade line there would be, and we'll see it in a map in a minute, where there was a little spur that went up to the fairgrounds up on Sykes Avenue.
That might have been quite a grade there, too.
Oh, yeah.
That would have been serious good.
Yeah. So here's a map of that area, again, coming from the stop at Heartland Village. Here's the main line that went on down into White River Junction. Present-day Route 4, present-day Route 5 coming down from up above, coming down and joining, about probably in there. So there's that engine house that we saw, and there's a turntable in front of it because they could store 2 engines there. And then there's a so-called car barn that by the time that photograph you just saw was taken had been taken down. And then a variety of coal sheds, and here was that spur that you could see cutting across and behind that view of the engine house heading up to the so-called fairgrounds. Yeah. And again, this was a separate railroad. Yeah. And it had its own charter, its own ownership, and it was literally known as the shortest railroad in Vermont because it wasn't part of the Woodstock. It had its own charter. We'll see a picture of that in a minute. And here's up on Sykes Avenue, about where the intersection, I'd say the bus station and the Chinese restaurant was right over in here. Yeah. Sykes Avenue and Route 5 came up the hill, and the Ryder truck facility just over on the other side here. But from 1890 to 1928, the Vermont State Fair was held, they held several state fairs around Vermont, but the one on the eastern side of Vermont was here at White River Junction, and in September every year, and huge fairgrounds. I mean, we could almost do a program on that in and of itself, and that was well photographed.
Racetrack out there.
There was a racetrack, and they had horses and whatever. And then after the fairground closed in 1928. It was in the 1930s, early 30s, it became an airport, and Amelia Earhart even flew into it. And actually, during the 1927 flood, they flew some airmail flights out of it to get mail delivered in Vermont because everything had been disrupted. All roads and track had been disrupted by the November 5th flood, November. So here we see 4 cars. And you're right, that must have been just a whale of a grade.
Oh, yeah.
Must have really required a good engineer and a good fireman, and to really
little sand coming out.
A little bit of sand. But these are heavy coaches,
Yeah.
and to pull 4 of them up that hill. But they would have a, they'd load them down in White River, and then come up and go sort of towards the Heartland station or the Hartford station, and then come back and make its way up the hill.
You spring the circus up there too.
Yeah,
All the circus trains used to go up that
Yeah.
thing.
yeah. So heading west from Quechee, we come to Tassville. Not as clear a picture as I'd like, but nonetheless, so there's the station, here's the covered bridge, which is still there after being rebuilt, and the railroad tracks coming through. The mill buildings that were squeezed between the tracks and the river and the road, now Route 4. And there's the combination post office and railway station for Tassville. There's the Tassville store over there. Some parts of this haven't really changed all that much. There was a brickyard up the side road here, and actually shipped a lot of brick. All of the bricks for the Gates block, Gates Briggs building, built in 1890 in White River, came out of the brickyard here and would have been shipped by the railroad. This is a view of the post office and station. I've got another view of this looking for sort of from the highway down, and it shows a bunch of milk cans out here, which would have been typical for the day. Here's the road that then went down to the covered bridge. And a map from that same magazine article. So there's the station, sandwiched in between the road, the main road, and there's a little bit of a common area. The Taft'sville store would be over in here. The nice brick Taft's house, power plant. It doesn't show the wooden mill buildings that had been taken down by then that would have been in this area. Here's the covered bridge still standing. But they had a lot squeezed into that area at one point. And lastly, we arrive in Woodstock. This view taken about 1915, I think, looking east. Looks like we've got an eastbound White River Junction bound train getting ready to leave. This building is still, and it's actually being rebuilt, somewhat restored right on Pleasant Street. And it had been horribly butchered with the eaves cut back and the tower taken down, but the owner is doing a pretty good job, all things considered, what he had to work with in getting it put back together. And train time, I believe that's a delivery wagon for Gillingham's. They had a big warehouse here, and were some of the first to really utilize the railroad as far as buying commodities in bulk and things like that. And then the Woodstock Inn always ran a coach to pick up passengers. Woodstock Inn was built in 1892, and it was built for resorts. Replaced several taverns and whatever that had been at that location. But those tavern buildings were getting very antiquated. And so in 1892, the town of Woodstock determined to sort of remake itself into a resort community. And so I don't know how many of you remember the original Woodstock Inn. Really a wonderful building, big wooden shingled style building. Quite flammable, I know, but nonetheless. It was actually, when it came down in 1969, it was sort of considered, it was called by some the last of the great flammables, because it would have gone up in a minute. But architecturally, it was a wonderful building. And Woodstock transformed itself, using the railroad into a resort community, and did so very, very successfully. There's a better view of the Woodstock stagecoach, an old tired Concord coach from years past, with a couple of nags hooked up to it. And again, the building still survives and is being put back together. I don't think it's ever going to be quite in its glory like you see here.
I'm going back one for just a second.
Yeah.
Is that another coach?
Looks like there's two there.
Yeah, there's two there.
Is that the male coach?
I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if one of them might have been a coach for the Kendron Valley in South Woodstock, picking up mail and passengers.
Because there's at the Postal Museum in Washington,
Yeah?
there's the mail coach that ran from White River to Quechee.
Oh,
Not
really?
White River to Woodstock.
Huh.
Yeah, and it's, as you walk in, it's right there. It's
Interesting.
beautiful.
Well, where is this in Washington?
Washington, Postal Museum, right there by, right there by Union Station.
Yeah, right next to the bus station.
And you can just barely see beyond here the engine house that was in Woodstock and the turntable. You can't quite make it all out, but there's a single stall engine house with a turntable in front of it. But I think I've got a plan. Yeah, there's just another view I had to throw in. By circa 1920, the Woodstock Inn had a big electric bus that was
Hard rubber tires.
hard rubber tired, charge the batteries after every 50 miles. And here we have a very nice late teens era Buick Roadster waiting the train, but a nice view of the building. Nice period building.
1920, they had electric bus?
Oh yeah, yeah. And that was actually towards the tail end of using electric for vehicles, because they just couldn't, the weak point was batteries.
Now we're going back.
Yeah. But the battery technology, Thomas Edison, everyone was looking to him to solve the problem, and even the great Thomas Edison couldn't figure out how to perfect a compact enough battery that would hold, sufficient charge.
Yeah.
And so very, very quickly, by 1903, 1904, the internal combustion engine was the engine for America. Steam was never really a viable option, and nor was electric, other than taxis in urban areas and stuff. So here we have a little diagram. Again, that's to Tassville and White River Junction with a little section house. We'll see that in a minute. And here's the station along Pleasant Street. These are some of Gillingham's, I think that was Gillingham's store warehouse. And this warehouse, freight house, I should say, is still standing. It's in kind of sad shape, but it's still standing. And the turntable, and the engine house, cattle sheds. Which one are the cattle sheds? Yeah, there's a cattle shed near where there's some water. But the idea was someday that this would continue on through Woodstock and make it to Bridgewater, which never happened.
What did Standard Oil have there?
Would have been some offloading facility of some kind. I don't know.
Oil or something?
Yeah. Well, by circa teens, 20s, Standard Oil was at its height, and and used the railroads extensively to move product. This one we've already seen, and I moved it around and forgot to delete this one, so we won't. Here's the A.G. Dewey, getting along in years, and again reboilered to burn coal, but they were still using it, even though they had several other locomotives by that point. But here it is getting oiled up in White River Junction. It was basically used by this point for more just miscellaneous freight service and not for their scheduled runs. So the second regular locomotive that the railroad bought was the E.H. Williams. E.H. Williams, or Edgar H. Williams, Edwin, I think, Williams, was from Woodstock. Norman Williams was his father, which the library is named for. But he made quite a career for himself at the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, PA, and became president. And so exactly what the arrangement was, with the Woodstock buying a brand new locomotive in 1892 from Baldwin, I don't know, but it was never a very successful locomotive. It required a lot of service, and it was not liked by the engine men, and they got rid of it by 1930, and after it had been replaced by several other locomotives we'll see in a minute. But a good picture in downtown White River. And there's one of the buildings that only recently came down on Railroad Row. Well, I say recently, maybe 30 years ago.
Redhead Acres.
Yep.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, here's the Williams with a train crew in Woodstock, circa 1910. You would have had an engineer and a fireman, and then you would have had a conductor who was in charge of the train, and then you would have had at least one brakeman, maybe two brakemen. Who's who in this photograph, I don't know, but that's the engine train crew. Nice view on a wintry day of the Williams approaching Woodstock, circa 1900. Beautiful open countryside, and probably about maybe a mile back from the station. So the third locomotive that the Woodstock bought was the J.G. Porter, named for their treasurer and a man who served on the board of directors as well. This was a fabulously successful locomotive for the Woodstock, reliable, well suited to the road, locomotive beloved by all. It never had the problems that the Williams had, and so this became their primary locomotive after they bought it in 1905. It survived for many years. When the railroad disbanded in 1933, it was sold to the Stratton and Company in Pennacook, New Hampshire, where there were huge flour mills. And it was used for many years after that to move flour cars back and forth. But here we see it on the turntable just after it had been acquired by the Woodstock. Interesting picture taken at Quechee. This would be the east side of the station. After a big snowfall, about 1910 or so, shows the porter with a horse-drawn sleigh and some pretty big snowbanks.
I guess.
And there is J.G. Porter. His first name was John, but signature. He ran a good tight ship. The Woodstock Railway, as I say, was always a well-run, well-administered, well-maintained, profitable railroad up until the very, very end. Here's the porter arriving on a cold winter day, and well, maybe it was in early November, like yesterday, arriving in Woodstock. Woodstock had a plow. It was a well-equipped railway, and this was their snow plow. It was a cast-off acquired from the Central Vermont. So you can see they were prepared for any natural event that might fall upon the railroad. The big plow, and someone would ride up above, and a locomotive would push it, and then they could fold these wings out to sort of wing the snow back further. So by 1906, they had a very noted Dartmouth professor of engineering, Fletcher, inspect the wooden bridge, and he said it needed to be beefed up, it needed to be reinforced. So that year, two great big laminated wooden arches were added inside the wooden bridge, and you see them here, but that only bought them about 4 or 5 years. And by 1911, it was clear that they needed to build a new railway bridge because of, again, heavier locomotives and especially heavier freight cars, coal cars, and heavier passenger cars. So in 1911, the steel-arched highway bridge, railway bridge, was built, designed by John W. Storrs, a very noted engineer, originally from Montpelier, Vermont, who had an office in Concord, and a very noted man in his time. But they poured new footings down in the gorge, and then piece by piece erected the two big steel arches, and then built off of those arches. And here they are putting the last piece of steel in, and then they cut away piece by piece the old wooden bridge and let it collapse down into the Quechee River to be swept away with a spring freshet or whatever. And I've often thought, as someone who's done a fair amount of permitting for projects over the years, can you imagine the Act 250 hearing for this? You know, and everything's going well. You're walking them through about why you need to do the new bridge, how it'll be built, and how it'll be a state-of-the-art bridge. And then you just sort of gently sort of suggest, well, and as to the old bridge, our plan is to, once we have the new bridge built around it, to then carefully, piece by piece, with men in there, cut this thing away and let it fall down into the gorge. And come spring, it'll get swept down the Quechee River and into the Connecticut, and life will be good.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that? No pound intended about Act 250, but needless to say, that's what they did. And that bridge was finished and was quite a structure in its day. Still the highest railway bridge in Vermont. And here we see the new bridge. It has since been converted, reinforced considerably, and been converted into a highway bridge, which we'll get back to in a minute.
It's the second bridge on that line.
That's right. And you can see they just sort of abandoned the, left in place, the original stone abutments of the wooden bridge.
Yeah.
But the wooden bridge is gone, having fallen into the gorge. Here we have a nice little postcard view, the replacement steel railway bridge.
That's our puzzle.
Is that your puzzle?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a nice view. Just a couple more. This is right as Route would be looking sort of westerly, right, making the curve at the top of Hurricane Hill. The interstate would right now be cutting right through there. But here we have an eastbound train coming down Hurricane Hill into White River Junction. The only accident on the Woodstock Railway in its 58 years of running was one morning on March 4th, 1906, as the mixed train westbound from White River Junction heading towards Woodstock derailed just barely east of the Tassville station. And apparently there was a buildup of ice in the tracks, which was just enough. And thankfully, due to the skill of engineer Harry Payne, he immediately knew what to do, and that kept the whole train from going into the Quechee River, because you can see it sort of leaning in that direction. But by later in the morning, they had, and luckily it was just the locomotive and the first truck on the tender that derailed. But by midday or so, it's my understanding that they had everything back on track, and no damage, to the locomotive or to the tracks. And scheduled service resumed. We were talking about cattle, and a lot of cattle was shipped out of Quechee, and here we see a special cattle train being made ready, and our old friend, the very aging A.G. Dewey, ready to pull the cattle cars to White River, where then the cattle will be, well, actually these are Boston and Maine cars, so they didn't have to transfer the cattle. And actually, now that I think of it, the Woodstock never owned a cattle car. So this would have been a special, train that was put together in White River of B&M cars and went through to Quechee to pick up cattle. And here we have a section crew heading out. 1920, they've got a little single-cylinder gas engine on their hand car. Here's their section house, and in the background you can see the engine house in Woodstock. And then just barely beyond that, the platform of the station, the covered platform of the station. But these boys are going to go out and inspect track and look for any loose connections or spikes and any washouts or whatever might be. So even though the railroad's days were coming, it was clear that the railroad was getting into trouble and was no longer profitable by the later 1920s. Nonetheless, they had the opportunity in the summer of 1930 to pick up this locomotive used from the Bangor and Aroostook Railroad, and they named it the H.H. Payne, after Harry H. Payne, who was their loyal and long-serving and faithful main engineer on the Woodstock. It required them building a bigger turntable, and this is in Woodstock, and that pit is still there, or at least the last I knew it was still there, if you know where to look for it. Chris is nodding accordingly. Thank you, Chris. But it was a good locomotive, served only for a couple of years, but it served the Woodstock well. And here it is in front of the Woodstock engine house. Here it is on Hurricane Hill doing snowplow duty in the middle of a storm, circa 1930-31, right along in there. By the summer of 1930, there had been a serious brush fire that destroyed 3 out of 4 of the passenger cars at the Woodstock, they're owned by the Woodstock Railway. And by that point, revenue was dropping off fast for the railway, and its days were clearly numbered. But nonetheless, here we see their one remaining passenger car and their number 4 locomotive, the H.H. Payne, here in Woodstock. I think that's the Gillingham's building, and that's the freight house, which is still standing. Pleasant Street, Route 4 would have been over behind that. So it was decided that the day had come and to suspend operations and close out the Woodstock Railway. And it was a very, very sad day indeed. I've heard from people who were on that last train. But there was a last run scheduled for Saturday morning, April 15th, 1933. There was some fresh snow on the ground. Here we see their newest locomotive, the H.H. Payne, and Harry Payne is in the engineer's seat. And they're just about ready to head to White River Junction, where there was going to be dinner at the Coolidge, and then everyone was going to return home, and that was going to be it. There were, of the 350 passengers, there were 14 of those had been on the first train 58 years earlier, and here is all 14 of them lined up. I don't know their names. I'm hoping that Jaira Billingham's mother, Polly, might be able to help me out on that. But nonetheless, there they are, and they were as young kids. 58 years earlier on the first run in September of 1875. And souvenir tickets were sold. Mrs. Franklin Billings, Jaira Billings' grandmother, had this ticket. And actually Jaira was telling me that both his mother and father and grandmother and grandfather were on that last run. And someone had the good sense to save his grandmother's ticket. So there's the station in the background, and there's the turntable pit, and they're getting ready to head out late 11 o'clock in the morning for White River Junction. And as someone was saying, that the rails were greased on the approach to Shalley's Hill, and they made 3 runs of it, and they just couldn't get up over. It was because they had 4 or 5. They had one passenger car, the remaining passenger car the Woodstock owned, and then the Boston and Maine had lent the railroad for this commemorative last run 3 or 4 very heavy passenger cars, and they just couldn't make it. So they had to back up to Quechee, and then several cars at a time bring them into White River Junction. So dinner was a little bit delayed. I don't know if Dave Briggs dinged them for that or not, because clearly Dave was not able to run them all through and get them back on the train. It got a little bit spread out and delayed, but nonetheless, everyone got to White River a little bit slower than usual, and everyone had a good dinner, and everyone made it back to Woodstock in the afternoon. And then several weeks later, the first spike was pulled, which was the beginning of the dismantling of the Woodstock Railway. The right-of-way was sold to, including the bridge at Quechee, was sold to the state of Vermont, who desperately wanted to relocate areas of Route 4. So here they are, and again, this was a really loved railroad, and I think it's hard for us to understand in this day and age how sad a moment this really was. I mean, there were people that, in that last run were in tears because the railroad was something that for 58 years you used, you went back and forth on, you could set your clocks to it. It was an integral part of life, in not only Woodstock, but Quechee, Dewey's Mills, so here everyone is looking at that first spike that was pulled. And then throughout the summer, they just sort of worked their way from Woodstock to White River Junction, pulling rails and putting them onto a flat car with a derrick. And the H.H. Payne sort of backed its way to White River. The other locomotives had been sold by that point, and whatever rolling stock that they had left. And this, I think, was right along, somewhere along the approach from VA Cutoff Road up to about the interstate. And because that hill looks very familiar in the background, which would have been just beyond Route 14 and the White River Valley down below.
Yeah, you're looking at through it, the edge of Hurricane, I think, yeah.
As I say, the J.G. Porter was sold to Stratton and Company, big flour mills located in Pennacook, New Hampshire, just this side of Concord, and served for many years. The H.H. Payne went down to the West River Railroad and ended up its days abandoned in South Londonderry, Vermont, where it was then cut up for scrap. The Dewey had also gone to Stratton and had been scrapped by this point. And as I say, Route 4 from White River Junction, or the intersection of Route 5, I should say, through to Quechee, was made into a relocated section of US Route 4. And this is a postcard view. You can see the White River Valley down below, and there's the railroad bridge across the White River beyond, and West Hartford would be beyond that. And
Amazing how many trees there are on those hills now.
yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And that other bridge you just showed is that famous fire when they went off.
Yeah, we could do a program on that sometime. So the big cut at Shalley's Hill, whenever I go through that, I think of the railway. They had to widen it, of course, to have adequate width for 2 lanes of highway, as well as ditches on either side. But, two views from almost the same vantage point. Again, the angle's a little bit different because there was a highway bridge that went across that the photographer that took this view in 1875 would have been on. And but nonetheless, it's pretty much the same view. And the former railway bridge across Quechee Gorge was widened and stiffened and received a concrete deck and was made into the highway bridge that we see today. And I've been told that was the first job that, I don't know if any of you remember Chick Miller, who owned Miller Construction Company. That's what brought, he was from Massachusetts originally, I think Groton, Mass, or Orange, Mass. And that's what brought him up here. The Route 4 relocation was an early WPA program. And he and his father got a contract for a lot of the rebuilding of the road, and especially for redoing the bridge.
And the bridge before that, how they get across the river before we located it.
Oh, it was the most circuitous route. To get from White River, was going down about where the woolen mills and whatever used to be, where Hartford Village, and then back up, and then across the railroad tracks and up through Center of Town Road.
Yeah.
And then there was at Shalley's Hill at that cut, there was a highway bridge there, and then you took an immediate turn and started coming downhill where the Fat Hat Factory, that maroon house is,
right.
And then you just continued down that hill
By Marshland Farm.
By Marshland Farm into Quechee, and then from there along the river. I mean, it must have taken you an hour to get from which now we can do in like 15 minutes. And then cross a Tassville covered bridge. But then you either stayed on the north side of the river and came in to Woodstock, about where Billings Farm is, or you could cross the Tassville Bridge and go up into Happy Hollow, whatever, and then down into Woodstock. So but it was the most. You look at the early USGS maps, and it was the most circuitous route. So you can understand why they were so eager to get a hold of the railroad line for the real estate. And with the automobile age upon us, Was ample opportunity for, even though it was in the era of the Great Depression, for little restaurants and campgrounds or whatever, or open up. And so this is right along just before Dewey's Mills. What had been railroad tracks is now a nice concrete highway. And here we have some gas pumps and place to get some eats, and the automobile age was with us. And then in 1947, the Dewey Corporation built a new mill ends and fabric store with a restaurant right on the rim of the gorge. The architects were Ted and Peg Hunter from Hanover. They had both been schooled in modern architecture at Hartford and came back to the Upper Valley and attempted to practice it. My father was also an architect, and he knew the Hunters and whatever. Builders hated doing their work because they were pretty demanding. I was close friends growing up with their son Chris, and one day in nursery school he and I got into a little tiff about something, and I bopped him on the head with a hammer. No blood was drawn and whatever, but everyone got the biggest kick out of that, and we were both big kids. The two 4-year-old big kids, both sons of architects, had gotten into a little tiff. But nonetheless, this was one of the Hunters' jobs, as well as completely redoing the Birchwood, the Dewey mansion just down the road a little piece.
Oh, they did that? That was awesome.
Yeah, it's now the last I knew it was the Pippin Inn. I don't know what it is now.
It was sold to somebody.
Yeah, he sold it.
Yeah. But in that era, people just hated that architecture. It was terribly dated, and unfortunately, a lot of good stuff was lost. But be that as it may.
Is this what they did to it?
This is a whole new building that they did, which is still there. But yeah.
Was it this style?
Yeah. And of course, taking an ornate old Victorian of Queen Anne style, and trying to redo it into something modern. I understand the difficulty they had, but it did win an award in 1950 or 51 from Better Homes and Gardens. And because it was for that generation, it was such a remarkable transformation, I should say, of an old Victorian frump into something fresh and new, that post-war generation. So one last view. There's the restaurant and mill end store we were just talking about. There's the rebuilt railway bridge into a highway bridge. There's Quechee Gorge. And I figure this view was taken shortly after the mills were down, or maybe not. It would have been, but I don't think you would have seen them. But regardless, and there's the Dewey Mansion with its turrets and towers and gingerbread cleaned off, and
The dam's still down there. Yeah, the dam.
Yeah. So last thing is just some suggested reading on all of these subjects. I've thrown an awful lot at you, but here's sort of where I've drawn from for various parts and pieces of this. And then, of course, you'll note the most recent book is one that I did 10 years ago, which is still available. And the arrangement that I have with the Historical Society is that we split the royalties. I don't think any of us are going to get rich on it, but it was certainly a lot of fun to do. And it's still in print and still selling. So there you go. Deborah Scheckman's book, she has a lot of tidbits about Quechee in there. And then, of course, John St. Croix, he had a lot of good information in his books. It's just that one minute you're in Quechee and the next minute you're in White River Junction and then back out at Dewey's Mills. But his information is good and all. Edgar Mead's book, which in a year or so I hope we'll have a sequel to that. And then, of course, I think Tucker's book has generally held up well, and is still a source of great information, more about the earlier development of Hartford, and really doesn't touch too much upon what we did tonight. So that's it.
Thank you.
And thank you for your patience.